Good afternoon and welcome to the CATO Institute. My name is Tim Lynch and I'm the director of CATO's Project on Criminal Justice. Today we want to return to the subject of drug policy, and in particular we want to focus today on the policies that are in place in the country of Portugal. Yesterday the CATO Institute published this new report by Glenn Greenwald, which we titled Drug Decriminalization in Portugal. And because Portugal is not a country that actually borders the United States, we thought it would be useful to put a map on the cover to help Americans find that country. In a moment, Glenn is going to tell us about his findings, but before he does that, I want to take just a minute or two to lay something of a foundation for our discussion this afternoon. For a very long time, all of the academics and analysts who studied drug policy had to acknowledge one reality, and that was that the drug policy of the United States is actually the drug policy of the world. Policymakers here in the United States said there had to be a united front against the black market drug trade, and the U.S. would give money to some countries and would lean on other countries to maintain that united front. But that hegemony by the United States, although it held for many years, is now no longer the case. It did not receive a lot of attention at the time, but in 2001, Portugal decided to reject the hard-line criminal approach to drug policy. Portugal decriminalized all drugs, including cocaine and heroin. It's not legalization because personal possession might still get you a fine, but it's not considered to be a criminal offense. The police still investigate and make arrests for drug trafficking offenses, so it is not, again, legalization. But by moving the personal possession of drugs out of the criminal realm and over to the civil side of the law, this move made Portugal the country with the most liberal drug laws on the books. Not many people know this. When if people wanted to hazard a guess as to which country had the most liberal laws, chances are that they would select the Netherlands. And it's true that if you go to Amsterdam, in the coffee shops, you will find marijuana sold out in the open. But that's more of a function of the police looking the other way. They're not enforcing the criminal laws that they have on the books. So although it's very tolerant, when we're talking about countries' actual laws, Portugal has the most liberal rules that are on the books. Now, when that dramatic shift in policy took place, I thought this was going to be very interesting because it seemed to me that around 2000, 2001, the drug policy debate here in the United States had pretty much exhausted itself. Those of us who attacked the prohibition model said it wasn't working, although we were spending a lot of money, making a lot of drug busts, building a lot of prisons, making a lot of arrests. Millions of people continued to use drugs. Drugs were still as widely available as ever, and the drug prohibition policy did not keep drugs out of our schools. What we did get was we got a lot of corruption, a lot of crime, and a lot of curtailment of our civil and constitutional rights. Now, the drug czar and the defenders of prohibition, they would respond and they would say things, well, yeah, it's true, things are not going very well, but things would get even worse if we were to move away from the prohibition model and adopt something like decriminalization. They said drug use might spike, there would be a public health crisis, and then it would be too late to turn back. So the feeling was that the moving away from the prohibition model was just too risky. It was something that we couldn't do. So it's no surprise that many people predicted that when Portugal made its decriminalization move, they predicted that that country would deeply regret moving in that direction. After a year or two of this policy in place, I waited to see if our drug czar at the time, John Walters, whether he would be pointing at Portugal as a reason why the United States and other countries needed to maintain the hard-line criminal approach to drugs. But he never seemed to mention Portugal. And as the years passed, I began to suspect that Portugal might be a success story that he wanted to keep quiet. Well, with Glenn Greenwald's research findings, we at the CATO Institute want to make sure that this success story does get told. Before we turn to the details of the Portuguese policy and what the effects have been, I also want to very briefly mention how the overall political climate is shifting in this area. There's mounting sentiment in other countries, again, to move away from the prohibition approach. And I just want to rattle off a few newspaper headlines that have been in my files over the past year or two. One headline read not too long ago, Canadian government tries anew to decriminalize marijuana. Another headline, Argentine president calls for decriminalization of drug use. Another one, Swiss voters back legalized heroin. And just a few weeks ago, 3 former heads of states, presidents of Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, blasted the U.S. prohibition approach and called for a reexamination of that policy. Here in the United States, the political climate is also changing. Let me give you a few examples of that. In November, voters in Massachusetts approved a ballot initiative that decriminalized marijuana in that state. In New York, lawmakers are suddenly revisiting and discarding the Rockefeller drug laws that have been in place since the 1970s. These are draconian mandatory minimum sentences that are placed on nonviolent drug offenders, talking about 10, 15, 20-year sentences that the lawmakers in that state are suddenly moving away from. The new Attorney General, Eric Holder, recently announced that the Obama administration is going to stop DEA drug raids in California and the 12 other states that have made marijuana legal for medical purposes. And Senator Jim Webb has been in the news a lot lately. He's a Democrat from Virginia, and he's called for a national commission to take a top-to-bottom review of the entire American criminal justice system. And he's made it clear that that includes a re-examination of America's drug laws. And in just the past 3 weeks, columnists and pundits have been speaking out on this subject. Eugene Robinson in the Washington Post, Clarence Page in the Chicago Tribune, Jack Cafferty on CNN, Joel Klein in Time Magazine. On the right, Dennis Prager and Pat Buchanan. All of these people say it's time to rethink prohibition. So the point is that up until very recently, you see, drug reformers have been trying to move policy kind of against the political winds. But very lately, it seems as if these political winds are shifting and they're now at the backs of drug reformers. So I think that this particular study that we're releasing could not be better timed. So with that background in mind, let's turn now to our guest speakers. But before I do that, I just want to take just a moment to ask those of you who came with cell phones, would you please double check, make sure that they are turned off as a courtesy to both of our speakers. Thank you. Our featured speaker today is Glenn Greenwald. Glenn came on the political and public policy scene about 7 years ago. Before that, he was a successful attorney practicing law in New York, but he became alarmed by the way in which the Bush administration was rationalizing away constitutional safeguards in the name of fighting terrorism. He started his own blog, and in a remarkably short period of time, his blog acquired a huge following, that following just continues to grow. You can find his blog posts over at salon.com. Glenn has also authored several best-selling books. In 2006, it was How Would a Patriot Act? In 2008, he published a book called A Tragic Legacy, How a Good versus Evil Mentality Destroyed the Bush Presidency. And last year, he published Great American Hypocrites, and all of these books have been very, very popular. He's really established himself as a principled defender of the Constitution and civil liberties, regardless of which party controls the White House and the Congress. And he was in New York just a few days ago where he was given an award for his independent journalism. One important thing that you may not know about Glenn Greenwald is that he's fluent in Portuguese. When we were looking to commission a study about Portugal, we were looking for a great researcher, a great writer, and somebody who knew Portuguese so he could get around that country. About a year ago, Glenn went to Portugal to do field research and to interview policymakers in that country to find out how things were going. And we're just delighted that he could be with us today to share his findings with all of you. So would you please welcome our first speaker, Glenn Greenwald.
Thank you very much for coming today, and thank you to the CATO Institute for sponsoring and enabling this report and this event, and thank you particularly to Tim Lynch, who really played an instrumental role in conceiving of the idea for the report and in helping to improve the manuscript and continuously offered helpful ideas and all sorts of challenges. It's interesting that when Tim first suggested to me the idea of examining the effects of decriminalization in Portugal, although I was, I'd say, fairly intensely interested in the idea of drug policy and drug policy reform, I hadn't actually been aware I was embarrassed to realize that Portugal had been a country that lived under a decriminalization scheme, a full-scale decriminalization scheme, for almost 7 years. Although my embarrassment was somewhat diminished as I began talking even to drug policy experts in the United States who also were, if not entirely unaware, virtually so, that there was a country within the EU that had enacted a decriminalization framework, and that 7 years had elapsed, and there was an opportunity to study, not in a speculative sense, but in an empirical sense, what the effects of that would be. And I'm still surprised, actually, that the episode of decriminalization in Portugal is something that has been studied very little and discussed even less so, even among experts in the drug policy field. And so I think studying what has happened since 2001 in Portugal provides really a unique opportunity for revitalizing the drug reform debate in the United States and elsewhere, because so much of what typically passes for drug policy debate is really nothing more than fear-mongering and speculation about what would happen if we legalized drugs or if we decriminalized drugs or lessened the harsh sentences that are imposed even for nonviolent minor drug offenses. Looking at what happened in Portugal enables us to get away from the realm of speculation and fear-mongering as well, and I think provides a uniquely valuable opportunity in that regard. Also, I do think that this is an ideal moment to talk about and to examine what has happened in Portugal. Tim mentioned some of the events just recently that reflect the fact that there's far greater openness to discussing drug policy issues, certainly than ever before in the United States, and I think part of that was catalyzed quite recently when the White House, as it typically does, pretended to be interested in great grassroots input into the kinds of questions that the president is supposed to answer and encourage people online to vote for what they consider to be the most important questions. And in virtually every field, questions about whether legalization of marijuana or drug policy reform should be pursued rose to the top of the charts. And I think, though, Obama's response disappointed a lot of people. Not so much because he said he didn't favor legalization. I don't think anybody expected him to answer otherwise, but because he was so snide and dismissive about the idea that it ought to be taken seriously, that turned into its own controversy, and I think spawned unintentionally some of the most meaningful and serious drug policy debates that we've seen in the mainstream in quite a long time. I mean, Tim mentioned the column by Joe Klein this week advocating legalization of marijuana, and if marijuana is in Time magazine, of all places, I think that's a pretty good reflection that the nature of the debate is evolving. I think the key to changing how drug debate takes place, drug policy debate takes place, is to refocus the question so that it ends up being entirely an empirical or pragmatic issue. There are obviously people who advocate legalization on ideological or libertarian grounds, namely the belief that the state has no right to regulate, let alone criminalize, the decisions that adult citizens make about what substances they choose to use and ingest and put into their own body. And if you believe in that ideological principle, it doesn't much matter what the pragmatic outcome of legalization will be. You just believe that drug laws that criminalize usage are inherently illegitimate, and you're likely already an opponent of the criminalization framework. Likewise, if you believe that there is something inherently immoral about drug usage and that it's the responsibility of the state to maintain the stigma against it and for us to come together and collectively declare through the use of our criminal laws or the abuse of our criminal laws this moral judgment that drug usage is wrong. And regardless of the outcome of that policy, it's vital that we maintain that moral decree as a society. It also doesn't much matter what the pragmatic outcome of policy changes will be, because then it becomes a moral question and not an empirical one. But I think largely the debate is driven by assumptions empirically about what is likely to happen if we decriminalize drugs or loosen our criminalization approach. And central to the debate has been this extremely unexamined assumption that if you loosen criminalization laws, let alone decriminalize or legalize, that what is going to happen, inevitably, is that there will be a massive explosion of drug usage, and that drugs will start to play a much greater role in every aspect of our society. And what that assumption does is it means that anytime there's a discussion of anything having to do with drugs that's negative